everybody. Welcome again to another episode of Dr. Jill Live. Today, I have a special guest that I just literally met a week or two ago. If you hadn't caught my episode, I think it's around number 91. It's called Breathe, What to Do After the Wildfires. I got on with Dr. Lynn Patrick and Dr. Louise Tolzman, who have both been instrumental in environmental medicine and really talking about what we can do about the air quality after wildfires, and also about what we can do for our bodies to detoxify. So if you missed that episode, check that out. But thanks to Louise, Dr. Tolzman, she introduced me to Levon, who I think is Levi what you prefer?
Levon, yeah.
Levon, okay, got it, Levon Durr, and he's the owner of Fungia. How do you say your farm?
Yeah, Fungaia, like Gaia.
Fungaia,
Yeah,
like Gaia, okay.
the earth, yeah.
Fungaia Farm, a mushroom company in 2011, founded in Humboldt County, California. I will formally introduce him in just a moment. I'm super, super excited to have him here because, as Louise was sharing after her conversation with him, we can actually use mushrooms. We'll hear all about that today to remediate our soils after the fires. I am certain this is going to be really valuable information. Many of you who've been listening, or if you've been watching the news at all, know, but just in case you don't, December 30th, just a little over a month ago, we had one of the most massive wildfires in destruction in the history of Colorado, our state. It destroyed nearly 1,000 homes and businesses, and they were all in my neighborhood of Louisville and Superior. Literally all around my office in Superior, Illinois, or Superior, Colorado, is destruction and devastation in neighborhoods that are completely gone. So the great thing about today's content is I'm going to learn right along with you from Levon, and I feel like this will be really, really practical in the next months and years going forward, because we know that there's all this devastation, and what's going to happen, especially on those areas of grassland that were burned, is the soil is bare, and so as it gets dry and the snow melts, we're going to have a lot of dust and debris and things. And as we talked about in the previous presentation, within these charred remains of the homes and things are so many toxic chemicals. So we're going to dive in today about maybe one of the solutions that you hadn't heard about before in mushrooms. And I am so, so excited to introduce my guest, Levon Durr. Like I said, Fungaia Farm, a mushroom company in 2011 in California. He's a passionate ecologist and spent most of his adult life farming and learning from nature. Levon holds certificates. I can't talk today. Levon holds certifications in permaculture design, permaculture teacher training, mushroom cultivation, and myco restoration, which is the topic of today. Through his journey with permaculture and mycology, he became more and more fascinated with the ways that we as humans could not only find balance with our surroundings, but also helps heal some of the wounds that have been inflicted on our earth. Fungaia Farm focuses on low-impact mushroom production, myco-remediation, and provides classes and supplies for people to grow their own mushrooms. So welcome, Levon. I am super excited to learn with you and our listeners today about mushrooms.
Thank you.
I love starting with stories. So I would love to know, we heard a little bit about how you got into this, but how did you get into mushroom farming and ecology and all this passionate business? I love it.
Yes, yes. I was an avid wild mushroom crafter in my late teens and early 20s, and that kind of got me more interested in learning about IDing lots of the, beautiful fungal, flushes that we have all throughout California. Spent some time up in Oregon, and the Pacific Northwest is just, well known for our beautiful forest and old growth that we have, and also the tremendous amount of rain we have, which the mushrooms love. The mild climate gives us a really long mushroom fruiting season, and so it's a spectacular place to wildcraft mushrooms. That led me into interest in cultivating mushrooms, looking at cottage businesses that kind of had a good niche for our area. Our mild climate's also a great place to grow mushrooms, so promoting that in our area for folks. And then the need and that to provide and be able to give people the tools and supplies that they need to grow their own food. So we set up our business in 2011, Fungaia Farm, and we initially started supplying folks with spawn and things to grow their own mushrooms, and then we transitioned and added fresh mushroom and medicinal mushroom production to our business also.
Wow. So you basically help people who want to grow their own. Do you also sell grown, like do you have a farm and you sell the produce from it, or so
Yeah.
multiple different ways?
Yeah, not very much uh, vegetables. We
Mhm.
grow a lot of food for ourselves. We do a little bit of excess sales, at the
Mhm.
local market. But yeah, fresh mushrooms. We do oysters, lion's mane, and shiitake, mostly fresh mushrooms. And then we also grow reishi and dry lion's mane for our tinctures, and we wildcraft turkey tails, and we grow cordyceps mushrooms for our tincture line too.
Oh, I love this. So, as a physician who's in functional medicine, we use mushrooms all the time for brain health and recovery from brain injury. Lion's mane is particularly good post-concussion. I'm sure you know. I'd
Yes.
like to know what you know about, again, because you might have as much or better knowledge as the medicinal purposes of these. But do you want to briefly talk about reishi and cordyceps and lion's mane and some of the ways that you see people using them?
Sure, sure. Medicinal mushrooms, they have a lot of overlap with, the health benefits that they have, but they also have very specific things that they can address for folks. And reishi's been known for a long time as this, really good builder for your immune system, supplies lots of nutrients and minerals and vitamins and beta-glucans and polysaccharides that are building blocks for a lot of our body systems. And so, not that we don't find these things in other places in nature, in plants and other things that we eat, but in mushrooms they're extremely concentrated. So, and they do have some unique things, like for instance, lion's mane or cordyceps, cordycepsins or Erinacea compounds that are very specific and aren't found in nature, in other things
Mhm.
that we eat, and so they can address really specific ailments and concerns that people have. You touched upon lion's mane, which is an incredible regenerative for the cellular structure of nerves and brain tissue and connective tissue. And so a lot of people suffering from a wide variety of those ailments or ailments that cause damage to those systems can benefit from regular use. And eating mushrooms is great. They lower your cholesterol, they give you protein, they're full of vitamins and nutrients, but getting the medicinal dose is really important for folks that are trying to address health concerns. So tinctures and supplements are a great way to get that regular usage where you can take that a couple times a day, and really see if that's something that helps you.
Wow, love it. Yeah, because again, I use all those in clinical practice and make recommendations. For full disclosure, I'm allergic to mushrooms. So I have to say that, like, and I have a lot of patients who have mold illness, and I want to just
Yes.
state this, the obvious here. First of all, often in the very beginning, when people are really sensitive to mold or fungally colonized, they don't do great on a lot of mushrooms. But
Yep.
I get this question all the time, so I'm just warding that off. Unless you're completely allergic to them, often after mold treatment, remediation and stuff for your own, physical body, you can tolerate these again. So this is one of the things best to talk to your doctor about. But
Yeah.
because I get so many people, what about mushrooms? I thought I shouldn't eat those. I don't think that's true for everyone at all. If you have, even if you had a fungal issue or mold exposure, but if you truly have an allergy, and interesting, you mentioned beta glucan. That's one of those components that's in these mushrooms. It's so powerful for immune support. We actually use the supplement, the derivative, the beta glucans for immune support, and these mushrooms. And as you mentioned, cordyceps and reishi contain that, or
Yeah.
maybe all of them, a little
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah. A little bit, all of them. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah, this is a,
exactly. Because you are eating spores, so
yeah.
if you're toxified with, yeah, spores,
Yeah.
mold is a fungus, so
That's where I was talking to my colleague who we both treat mold related environmental toxicity and illness, and we were both saying it's a love-hate relationship. Like we really do clinically use mushrooms. We love them. I'm a
yeah,
huge advocate, so don't get me wrong here. But
totally.
because I know I'm going to get those questions, if someone's in the midst of a severe colonization of fungal issues or mold toxicity, sometimes it's best just to temporarily take them out and then add them back in at a later date. And
Yeah,
it's all balance, but
yeah,
they're powerful. And part of what we're talking about is so my background is again mold in the environment and how it affects the human body, and it's
mhm,
fungus, right? And what it does is it remediates material, which is what we're going to talk about because it chews up and eats up and just causes it to go back to the form that it should be. But
yeah.
if it's in our house, maybe not so good compared
Not
to
so
the
good.
garden.
Or even when we're farming, we have to wear respirators and stuff just because the amount of
Yeah,
spores, specifically like oysters or
yeah,
reishi or something, and certain spores germinate faster and are more irritant to our lungs than
yeah,
other, spores, so the size, the shape,
yeah,
the variety of spore that it is, and so being someone that works around it all the
yeah,
time and does a lot of just shoveling wood
yeah.
chips, around and lives in a wet environment, we have to be careful. And then even in the fruiting room, it's not a big problem for somebody that, just grows a couple oysters in their
Yeah.
house or something, unless they have a mold allergy. But, but somebody that works around it daily, you have to be careful.
I'm so glad you said that because that's again, I'm such a big fan of what we're going to talk about. And I think it could be for almost anyone, even someone like myself, to have in my home. But like, I love the caveats because, of course, my population, a lot of the listeners are like, we have mold illness. What do we do? So just that precautions and things.
Exactly.
But it doesn't mean you can't necessarily eat them or take them or do that. And again,
Right.
it depends. So let's talk about like what kinds of mushrooms are best for, and first of all, just remediation in general.
Mhm.
We know that mold and spores and fungi in general, their job is to turn over the earth. Tell us a little about this background and why it's important to, someone after the fires.
Yeah. So we know, like you pointed out, that fungi are remediators and they're digesters. And if we didn't have them, we would be standing in 100 feet of organic waste on the planet. So they dissolve everything around us, break things down through this enzymatic like activity, where the mushroom that we kind of referred to, just to give a little context, is kind of the generic name for the fruiting body of the organism.
Okay.
What the larger mass of the organism that we're talking about, the fungi, is the mycelium, and this is the root-like structure that grows through the substrate, be it the leaf mulch in the forest floor, or a log in your backyard. This is where the big organism is existing. People have equated it to, say, for instance, what you're seeing is the apple on the tree. So the apple pops up out of the ground, but the tree is underground, and that's the mycelium. Well, the way the mycelium eats its food is by secreting these really powerful enzymes, somewhat similar to, like, say, our pancreatic enzymes that
Mhm.
we use to break proteins and carbohydrates down. And so it's secreting these through these little hyphae threads, right? They kind of look like cobwebs.
Yeah.
And these cobwebs can grow extremely fast, and they can break down a wide variety of materials and very, very dense bonds. So obviously, its favorite food is carbonaceous materials. It's looking to eat like lignins and cellulose out of the materials, and out of that get the sugar. Of course, they use minerals and other things to build their structure, and that's why they're so medicinal. But when we're just talking about remediation, we're looking at using that same enzymatic process to break down other bonds, be it like chemical bonds or
Mhm.
hydrocarbon bonds and things like that. So there's been a lot of great research looking at what fungi and molds and yeasts can break down what different chemicals. So we kind of have that like knowledge now. There's been some great books written and people have researched all that. A lot of it's been in the laboratory setting,
Mhm.
and bringing that out into the real life, in the field is kind of where the movement is right now. Is understanding how to take a biological organism and give it these very specific parameters of humidity and temperature, where it's comfortable to live, and then if there's a contaminant that we're looking at breaking down, like say hydrocarbons, for instance, how can we create the environment where that mycelium will thrive and also come in contact with the hydrocarbon and also molecularly disassemble the hydrocarbon so it can get at that carbohydrate bond? Because that's all it's doing with a piece of wood, too.
Yeah. Wow. So love this. So basically, what you're starting to teach and give opportunity for people in your state of California, and we'd love to do that here too, is to how could we actually grow or use the mushrooms? Would you use it in like say we have these subdivisions that are gone, and of course with the debris there is concrete, and I mean it's just nasty. There's still yards and stuff, but then there's also these areas of just grassland or area where it just went open space and it just completely obliterated the grass
Sure,
cover. Where would
sure.
you recommend, like, say, the city of Louisville wants to use mushrooms? How would you advise a city on rebuilding after a wildfire and use of mushrooms?
Great, great. Well, because I give these talks, frequently, and I get a lot of questions from folks, I like to just clarify. So there's the process of pulling toxins out of the ground
Mhm.
and embedding them into something, which is commonly used for like phytoremediation, where you plant grasses or
Mhm.
sunflowers and or alfalfa, and you pull the contaminants, say for instance lead or
Mhm.
cadmium or some toxic heavy metal, and you pull that up into the plant. Mushrooms are capable of doing that, which also makes them a candidate for being toxic too,
Yeah.
because they can be full of lead
That
in.
was my next question. Well, good to like if you can you eat these? Because I'm assuming
Yes.
no.
No.
Yeah.
Right. But when it comes to organic compounds, again, like say hydrocarbons or man-made
Yeah.
chemicals like pesticides or flame retardants, we can use the mycelium to
Uh-huh.
break down and molecularly disassemble those bonds and let the mycelium get at that carbohydrate that it wants to
Yeah.
eat. And then we end up with base salts, some gases, and this non-toxic substrate if we've broken it down sufficiently. Mushrooms are capable, like we just mentioned, of bioaccumulating heavy metals. In two of the three hydrocarbon remediations we did using oyster mycelium, we
Mhm.
never fruited the mushrooms, right? We never grew actual
Got
fruiting
it.
bodies
Yeah.
like mushrooms. So we're just using the mycelium.
Okay.
So that's that. So that's
Kind of like the underground network, right? When you're talking
yes,
about,
the
yeah, okay.
underground network, right?
Got it.
Creating the fruiting conditions to bioaccumulate the heavy metals into the fruiting bodies and then harvesting those fruiting bodies just as you would
Yeah.
plants and then removing that and throwing that into a landfill or incinerating it and reclaiming the metals or whatever is possible, but it's a lot more complicated than growing alfalfa or
Yeah.
sunflowers on a
Okay.
site. So that's where phytoremediation really excels. Where mycoremediation really excels is using the fungi is when you're just dealing with organic compounds like hydrocarbons,
Okay.
because metals don't really break down.
No.
Maybe
Yeah.
in a supernova or something. I'm not sure what happens,
Right.
but if, as for instance, again, just use a classic example of like lead.
Mhm.
You can bioaccumulate that into plant matter and then remove that plant matter. So that would be something I would recommend for folks that are looking at heavy metal
Mhm.
toxicity. But if there's flame retardants and
Yeah.
and chemical spills and hydrocarbons and things like that, that's where the mycelium really excels in actually breaking those contaminants down. And
The biodegradable. So it can just be, so let me, as a layperson, again, this is all new to me. So I'm going to try to reframe what you said and see if I'm getting it right for the
okay,
listener. So it sounds like the mycelia, which is that network that's underground, it's not really the fruiting. So we wouldn't even see any mushrooms. We just plant this. And are they spores that you plant, or what do you actually like put on the
just the
ground?
mycelium
Yeah.
itself.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you have to cover, say, I was a homeowner, my house burned and I want to rebuild and my yard is covered with hydrocarbons and stuff. Is this an example where you could actually put the mycelia in my yard and what would happen if there's, obviously if it's burned, there's no grass, it's just dirt. Do you need a dirt ground cover? What if there's grass there? Does it compete?
Mm-hmm. Good question. Good question. So there is major challenges with the right time of year. The
Yeah.
temperature is it too cold? Is it too hot? Is it too dry? Because you have this living organism that you have
Yes.
to take care of. So just to back up, so the first thing we always want to do is gather knowledge, and you know this as a doctor, right? Somebody comes to you and they
Yeah.
say, "I think I have Lyme's disease." They're like, "Well, let's test." You
Hmm.
know, I think I have lupus or something, right? It's like, no, we have tests for that. And it's
Hmm.
the same with remediation.
Okay.
Test, test, test. So we
Got
want
it.
to do hydrocarbon tests. We
Hmm.
want to do chemical analysis. We
Okay.
want to do metal analysis.
Got it.
And that's your starting point. What
Okay.
is actually the problem and what do I need to remediate? Of
Got
course,
it.
there's metals everywhere, right?
Hmm.
Which are the really toxic ones and which are the toxic levels, right? It's
Yeah.
okay if we eat a little bit of zinc and a little bit of copper, but if
Yeah.
we eat too much, it's poisonous, right?
Right. Right.
You know, um, and so that's where I always encourage people to start is find your local soil testing,
Yeah.
water testing company and contact them. They usually have little containers you can pick up and go and take tests throughout your property or your
Okay, so
field
as
or
you
whatever.
start with testing, love this because this is just what I do. So you
Exactly.
test your soil,
Mhm.
and then finding out, and you can either have like hydrocarbons, flame retardants, chemicals, benzenes, toluene, whatever, and those are more
Yep.
there, or you're
Yep.
going to have metals, which two different solutions, two different
Two
problems,
different
right?
solutions. People are looking at microremediation for metals. There was a report just published where they were doing dried mycelial mats and they were burying
Wow.
them in the soil to absorb lead. They didn't
Oh,
really tell you how they were doing it. They just
yeah.
said they got a grant and it was through this university. But it was a pretty cool project. I could put links later to
Okay.
after this
Cool.
talk or what
Yes.
have you. Um, it just popped up in my feed and I was like, that's really interesting.
Cool.
There has been mushrooms that have found also to bioaccumulate huge background levels of like radioactive isotopes.
Yeah.
Again, sort of acting like a metal
Uh-huh.
that the mushrooms were bioaccumulating into the fruiting bodies. But super challenging to create those conditions to fruit the mushrooms. Whereas plants just excel in absorbing heavy metals. This might be multiple years of planting alfalfa or grasses, or there's also a couple mustards in the mustard
Uh-huh.
family. Very hardy, mustards, they grow like weeds everywhere,
Mhm.
right? They're all over the
Yeah.
planet. But you might be growing it, planting 2 or 3 crops a year, collecting that biomass and drying it and disposing of it, and then retesting the soil and seeing if your lead levels
You
have
just-
gotten lower and lower, right?
This is
So
so
that's
cool because it's so parallel to humans and say they have lead or mercury. We're using clay and charcoal and binders in the body. And of course, other things like alpha lipoic acid and glutathione. And so we're pushing the toxins out. We're collecting them usually in the bowel through the stool. And
right.
then we retest the human body and say, is the level lower? So it absolutely parallels what we
Exactly.
do it.
Right. We are of the earth for sure.
Yes.
And these systems, I like to point out to people that, on the family tree, plants and fungi branched off.
Yeah.
And then millions of years later, animals and fungi branched off. So genetically, we have a lot more similar processes to fungi than we do. That's why they're not really a plant, they're not really an animal,
Yeah.
but they're definitely not vegetarian. They eat
Right.
insects. They attack larvae. They're
Wow. I didn't know. We're having a whole other talk about what else do mushrooms do because
yes, yes,
that's fascinating.
yeah. They're very, very advanced beings. Yes, and they've been
Wow.
here a lot longer than us. So surprise, surprise, they come across a hydrocarbon molecule and
Yeah.
like, what's a hydrocarbon? It's just a bunch of organic matter that piled up before there was fungi on the planet and turned into hydrocarbons,
Yeah.
right? So it's not like oyster mycelium, Pleurotus ostreatus is going to run like down into an oil field and eat on the oil. We need to have that oil in a state. We need to have that chemical in a state that's going to be, hospitable to that mycelium for it to grow. And that sort of leads me to
Got it.
kind of describe the microremediation process.
Yes.
So for instance, the 2 projects we've done, hydrocarbons, huge problem. Oil spills everywhere. People spill gasoline. People have spills. Company has spills. It washes up on the beaches. We don't know what to do with it. The landfills are filling up. Nobody wants, these hazardous wastes, right? So along comes the fungi, amazing remediator. So what we did in two of the 3 projects we did up here, we actually grew the mycelium out on burlap and straw. And
Yeah.
we brought these rolls of inoculated, fully colonized with the oyster mycelium, rolls of burlap. And then we layered this in sort of a lasagna type layer
Yeah.
of contaminated soil with some straw, with the mycelium, with a little more straw, with some contaminated soil. And you can read this whole report on our website if people are interested in implementing this in their own area. So we basically created these really small piles because we don't want to create a thermophilic like compost pile where it gets too hot for the mycelium. The mycelium wants to live at like 60, 70 degrees, not 140,
Uh-huh.
120 degrees.
Yeah.
And then we tarped everything. We contained the soil, right? Because it's contaminated. It's a hazardous waste. We kept rain off of it, and we treated this soil. In the case of the diesel fuel spill, we treated the soil twice. In the case of the motor oil spill, we treated the soil 3 times. So these projects took over a year to 2 years, partly because we're dealing with the cold winter and too hot summer, and so we have these little spring and fall windows where we could get this mycelial growth to happen and get the remediation to take place.
Wow, that's so fascinating. So yes, we want links. I'll be sure and share them if you're listening, wherever you're listening, we'll have links to this in your website for sure, because this is fascinating to me. I think what we're talking is some of the future of environmental remediation and climate change and all the things that we are dealing with, right? We need new solutions. This is actually a really old solution because mushrooms are so, but it's kind of like, to me at least, I'm fascinated and I love this. So my other question, you mentioned climate. So again, if we were going to use this in some area with the wildfires around our community, we're in Colorado, it's super dry. Is Colorado too dry for mushroom growth, or could it be certain times of the year?
Yeah,
Um,
pretty much everyone has a time that it's
yeah.
like,
Okay.
below 70 degrees in their community,
Mhm.
and you're just finding those specific windows,
What's too cold then? If 70 is kind of the upper limit, what's the it like?
then of like below 40.
Okay,
Yeah, so you're really trying to find this perfect, like the mid 60s,
got it.
low
Yeah.
60s. It's like that's what pretty much most things are going to kind of thrive at. And so this takes monitoring, and like you mentioned, this is a very old technology. We're just using this biomimicry of this process where if we all vanish today, fungi would just come in and
It's
eat.
still they just do it automatically, right?
They just eat this computer, right? They'd eat my whole house. They'd
Yeah.
eat this computer, right? It would all be gone in a few thousand
Yeah.
years. We're just trying to use these processes to speed things up because as people have begun to realize, as populations on the planet have gotten bigger and bigger, and our landfills have filled up, and we've created more, Superfund sites and toxic, hazardous waste everywhere, there is no away when you decide to throw this contaminated soil. We're just moving it to someone else's watershed, and
Yeah.
sure, maybe the landfill's lined, but that liner is a ticking time bomb too, right? That's going to degrade.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
some fungi is going to eat that, and then,
Yeah.
and then it's just leaching into the river. And so it takes a long time for these like natural cycles to process all this material, where we can speed this up by creating the perfect environment for the fungi to live
I
and break
love
these.
that thought. That brings us back, like you said, because this is what's already happening. This is why, part of why mushrooms exist to
Yeah.
just the circle of life. But it makes so much sense to think about it as the way your company is teaching people to use it is just accelerating the process and giving you a specific space or home or, a
Yes.
place for this to happen. Um, would this be so from what you said, of course, the myceli, what do you call them?
Mycelium.
Mycelia.
Yeah.
These guys go under, and these are the hydrocarbons. They like to chew that up or whatever. And that
Yep.
would be, like you said, with oil spills or any sort of hydrocarbon toxicity anywhere.
Yep.
Then we talked about the metals and the fruiting body. Now that's going to take more because you're actually growing and you have to have really good conditions to get it to fruit. And that also you're going to throw that away or not throw it, but burn it or
Yes.
whatever because that
Yes.
would not be consumable due to toxicity, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. There's a great book. Lila Darwish wrote a book called Earth Repair, and she
Mm-hmm.
kind of combined these three systems, looking at phytoremediation,
Yeah.
microremediation, and bioremediation. And it's really interesting. Like when I read the
Can you
book,
just
it was.
define for those listeners and someone like me, phyto, bio, and myco? Tell
Yes.
me what
Yeah.
these things
Thank you.
are.
So phyto is using plants
Plants.
to
Mhm.
remediate. Myco is using fungi to
Mhm.
remediate, and bio is using bacteria.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fascinating. So really quickly, you mentioned a few plants, and I know you're not the expert in bioremedi or phytoremediation, but what are some of the other common like phytoremediators in this realm?
Yeah. So we know that that plants pull up minerals out of the
Mhm.
ground, and metals are just like another mineral to the
Yeah.
plant, and some just seem to bind with them faster and pull them up out of the soil quicker. Of course, you're also dealing just like with the
Yeah.
microremediation, how deep are those roots going and how deep is that lead?
Yeah.
What was exciting about our conversation is if the ash is just right on top of the
Yeah.
soil, then that's great. It's not as if there was a copper mine or
Yeah.
something where these chemicals leached into like some sandy
Right.
soils
Deep
five
into the
feet down.
earth.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Okay.
Which might need to be tilled and planted until the metals, really reduce. This is a huge problem in urban settings too. People converting parking lots and old
Yeah.
empty lots to community gardens, where they can't use the soil that's
Mhm.
there, and stuff like that. So again, yeah, alfalfa has been found to pull up metals quite well. It's pretty resilient, grows in a
Mhm.
lot of different environments. Sunflowers, again, right? Super hardy, drought
Yeah.
tolerant plant, big root system. Plant them really close together, do a thick crop of them, and certain mustards have been
Mhm.
found to be really good remediators. So also another aggressive,
Yeah.
really prolific, vegetative, drought tolerant, a plant that you can work with.
So I want to talk about species of mycoremediators, but before I move to that, one thought is we have this natural shrubbery and grasses and stuff, and some like competing things get introduced, and then all of a sudden I can't remember the name of the tree that's now endemic here in Colorado that was brought in. And would any of these plants or these mushrooms take over the natural habitation, or would they just do their thing and kind of?
Great question. Great question. Right. We don't want to bring in another problem.
Mhm. Yeah,
You go to Hawaii and they're like, and then they release
yeah,
ferrets.
exactly. Right.
And now there's ferrets everywhere. Yeah, totally. We've seen a lot of those all over, right? Oh,
Yeah.
we're going to put this beach grass in
Yep.
control the dune, the sand drift in Humboldt County. And now we have this invasive beach
Right.
grass
Exactly.
everywhere. Yeah.
Exactly.
So, yeah, that is a good thought. We can clone and replicate local wild
Yeah.
mushrooms. So that is
Okay.
an option
Perfect.
that's totally viable.
Wow.
That being said, oyster mushrooms are growing on like every continent on the planet. Bringing in a more domesticated commercial oyster mushroom that we know is really aggressive, grows in a more broad temperature range. The fact that we're not producing fruiting bodies that would produce spores. This is a very short life thing. The
Okay.
mycelium is dead in a couple months.
Got it.
Pleurotus ostratus, the oyster mushroom that we used for our remediation, um, does not live in soil. So we were asking it to eat all this straw
Got it.
and come in contact with some soil that
Yeah.
was soaked in diesel fuel. And as soon as it ran out of food, it died.
Got it. It's like
You
just
know,
giving it its little food source caveat,
yeah,
and then
it's
it's
kind of like that. So it's like there's not a huge risk of it sporulating, and even if we went there, if when a mushroom fruited and it spored, if it wanted to cross genes with the wild oyster mushrooms, like it could,
yeah.
and for that matter, everyone's growing this mushroom that I'm shipping all
Yeah.
over the country constantly, anyways. And so there's very little restrictions on these things,
Okay.
like shipping to other
Yeah.
countries or Hawaii, even. It's on the
Yeah.
listed allowable. Hawaii's very restrictive
Yeah.
on
So
what
you
we
know
can.
it's probably pretty safe. Okay.
So it's like very unlikely that it would, yeah, go feral or cross.
Got
And
it.
even if it did, it has been for millions of
Yeah.
years already. These are
Okay.
windborne,
Yeah.
spores all over the planet. Yeah.
Okay, that makes so much sense. And something else you just mentioned that when we first started talking about, because of listeners with mold and allergies, when we're doing these mycelized microremediation, we're not even growing the fruiting body to spore. So it's actually also less, if there is an allergy, it's less likely to cause an issue as well. Would you say that's true?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And it's not that it wouldn't happen if
Yeah.
you created fruiting conditions. And I assisted with the project in town here, and they just happened to do it in the spring, and it
Yeah.
happened to be really foggy and drizzly and warm and rainy. And she took the tarps off and grew these giant
Wow.
plate-sized oyster mushrooms in her backyard. Of course, we advise people not to eat those because
Yeah.
there may be heavy metals in the hydrocarbons that you just
Right.
picked up, right? When you have engines grinding metal against each other, it can have heavy
Yes.
metals and waste, hydrocarbon products.
Yeah. Wow. So this is fascinating. And do you see communities, obviously, with these big oil spills, it makes so much sense. And that's so exciting what you've already been involved in the future of that, because we continue to have these accidents and ruin our environment. And it's nice to have some solutions. But how would you see it for an average community? Like, say you were to say for Louisville and Superior, what would you see as possibilities to use mushrooms in the community where there's been wildfires? Would it be on the open space? Would it be in people's? I'm still trying to figure out, like, if people wanted to use them, where would you recommend they do that, or
Hmm.
how? Or,
Yeah,
well, you
yeah.
said first test, so they need to know what's going on,
Right,
right?
right, right. Testing,
Yeah.
and then in the sense of if we just take the fire,
Hmm.
as the issue,
Yeah.
when we had a diesel tank, spill,
Yeah.
it soaked 7 feet down into sandy loam,
Uh-huh.
soil. So let's say there wasn't heavy metals there
Mhm.
before,
Right.
which there might be,
Yeah.
but let's say there was there was just a home burned down, and now
Yep.
there's the chemicals from the ash and all
Yeah.
the appliances and
Right.
couches and everything. So it's very likely that the first 2 or 3 inches of soil is all that would need to be
Yeah.
removed. Right. So I would take that and I would scrape that up. I
Mhm.
would get it tested, obviously, know what I'm dealing with. If it was heavy metals, I would do the phytoremediation using plants. I would
Okay.
plant plants in the soil. I would harvest that biomass. I would dry it and then dispose of it. If it was hydrocarbons or some other, organic compound, I would then address the right chemical for the right, the right fungi for the right chemical. There's some great books out there. I'm always happy to consult with people
So
on
you're saying it's actually even deeper than that. Like there's enough data that they say they have these three chemicals. There's probably some types of mushrooms that are better than others at remediating
Yes,
those.
yes.
Okay,
Now,
fascinating.
obviously,
Love it.
there's a reason why turkey tail are on the front of this book
Wow,
is
because they're
because turkey tail is a huge remediator,
okay.
and surprise, surprise, turkey tails are growing on, everything in my yard. They're
Yeah.
growing on Doug fir, they're growing on oak, they're growing on tan oak, they're growing on some apple cuttings. They'll grow on anything is basically the answer to that. And oyster mushrooms are another big remediator because they are super willing to eat a lot of different things. They'll grow on newspaper, they'll grow on straw, they'll grow on a huge wide variety of woods. So when you see that diversity where a saprophytic fungi, a wood digester,
Yeah.
its adaptation has allowed it to eat a wide variety of different woods and break those bonds. If it can eat a conifer
Yeah.
loaded with all these resins and right
Mhm.
and it can at the same time eat an oak like a hardwood, you can see the diversity of its digestion.
That's probably going to be a good micro-remediator because it's
Yes.
right. Cool.
Right. Whereas some things are very, very specific. They
Yeah.
only grow on these woods. And so these folks in these books have researched all these different yeasts and
Wow.
molds, and it's not always 100%.
Yeah.
Sometimes it degraded at 70%. Sometimes it degraded at 90%. Sometimes it degraded at 50%, and you had to do it three
Yeah.
times to
Yeah.
get it fully broken down.
Oh, this is so fascinating. It's such a parallel to, again, I treat mold-related illness. So I use different binders in the human body, and each of them have different affinities for different types of mold. So I might have aspergillus or penicillium and use, certain types of binders. And then if I have Stachybotrys or Chaetomium, I'll use clay and charcoal. And so in a different way, it's very similar to our bodies, and I see
There's
lots
so
of
much.
parallels. Well,
So
so this is fascinating. So is there anything we haven't talked about that your company does? Obviously, the bio or the micromediation, the oil spills. You've done two separate specific endeavors that were written up on the
yeah.
oil spills, right?
Yeah, yeah. So the report on our website was our first like big project, and so it was
Mhm.
huge learning
Yeah,
experience. So a lot of the report I wrote about what we did wrong because I really wanted to
we learn,
impart
right? That's how
to
we
people,
totally. I
yeah,
love it.
don't repeat these
Yeah,
wrong mistakes. This is what went right, and the
yeah,
project was successful and it worked. But I
yeah.
want people to skip over the failures and get right
Uh-huh.
to the success. The motor oil spill was great, and I knew a lot more when we addressed that. That I made into a short YouTube video. You can kind of
Cool.
see because I wanted people to really get the tactile experience
Yeah,
of seeing the process in the field. And some of the challenges, it was snowing where they were, and then it was 100 degrees, so
yeah.
we had to do three different treatments, and the oil was very viscous, and it was just like this sloppy sludge of soil. And so I noticed that the mycelium was having trouble penetrating in there. The
Yeah.
straw was decomposing kind of fast, so we switched to some wood shavings and started mixing inoculated wood shavings in on the second and third treatment, and that was more successful. You see, we only got a 30% reduction the first time,
Mhm.
and then we got a 70% reduction, and then we got a 90% reduction, and we
Wow.
were like, okay, this is good enough for her to use as her driveway. This was used motor oil, so we never did a heavy metals test, so
Yeah.
this isn't like, oh, plant my
Right.
veggies right here now. Yeah.
Cool. Well, this is so fascinating. I love it because it's a new topic that I did not know much about. And it's so parallel to what I do, just like fits in and
Definitely.
so important. Um, well, any last, first of all, I think we'll end with any future like things that you see that maybe haven't been done that you just based on what you've seen and known and like that you would love to see happening in your world of mycology and
Yeah.
molds.
Well, the lovely thing about these technologies is they're very achievable by the average person,
Mhm.
right? There's
Yeah,
plenty of remediation companies out there that have solvents that will
yeah,
dissolve chemicals, dispersants that will get the oil off the top of the ocean and send it to the bottom.
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
and some of them are great, some of them clean it up completely, some of them, don't. This technology, it's not a silver bullet. It's just another tool in our tool belt to have at our disposal. What's wonderful about it is anybody can grow some oyster
yeah.
mycelium, right? Oysters are so forgiving. They're literally like the easiest mushroom to cultivate, that you can take an oyster mushroom and cut the stem off and roll it up in some cardboard and start oyster spawn in your
Wow.
backyard. So yeah, no spores, no
Yeah,
mold, just mycelium growing. Put it in some straw, mix
yeah,
some contaminated soil in that straw, test it
yeah,
before
yeah,
and test it after and see if it was successful. So it's
yeah,
a very achievable thing, like growing mustards
yeah,
or alfalfa. You can test the soil. It usually costs about 60 to $70 to do a heavy metals test on your soil, and then you can test it after. Did I draw enough of the lead out of my soil? So um, we are totally open for Zoom consultations. We do sell supplies for
yeah.
people and grow things. Obviously, shipping is not practical.
Uh-huh.
These micro remediation needs to happen in your local community and grow it. We can supply cultures and things like that, and things to get started. But yeah, this is something that people have to grow on site most of the time. I did ship a roll of inoculated burlap to a student in New York that was doing a
Wow.
microremediation project. And so the
That's
shipping was
cool.
very expensive.
Yeah, I bet the heavy. Wow. So where can people find you? Where is your website, and is there links there to? I'll again include whatever you share with me, but
Great.
tell us where to find you.
Yeah, yeah. So we're in Northern California.
Mhm.
People think, San Francisco,
Yeah,
that's Central California.
all the way.
It's a long state. We're an hour from the border, on Humboldt, right around the bay in Humboldt County. Our website is fungaiafarm.com.
And spell that out just to be sure everybody's got it.
Yes, Fungaia.
Farm.com. Perfect.
Yeah,
Awesome.
fungaiafarm.com. And we do classes and consultations and sell spawn and, lots of, supplies for people to grow edible medicinal mushrooms or do remediation.
Mhm.
Um, and we're on Instagram, Facebook, and all stuff like that. We love hearing from people. We love hearing about projects that are people doing, and just really love promoting, this community action, to clean up the
Yeah.
earth.
Awesome. Well, thank you for letting me be part of what you're doing and interview you. It's so fun to learn new things. Love what you're doing, and keep
Thanks.
letting me know how I can support you.
Great. Thanks for having me.